Blackbirding is the kidnapping or deceiving someone into working as a slave or a poorly paid worker. Blackbirding was not an exclusively Australian practice, but we are going to focus on the case study of British colonists in Australia. In Australia, the victims of blackbirding were mostly Pacific Islanders, but also included Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. Welcome to Black British Hub, where I explore histories of the racialised peoples of Britain and the British Empire. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and keep notified. The first European settlers arrived in Australia on January 26, 1788, and the first colony, New South Wales, was created on February 7, 1788. For many years on Australian land, there were multiple European settlements that became colonies and later were federated, forming the present 6 states of Australia. Slavery existed from the start in 1788, when convicts from Britain were transported as punishment and were forced into labour. Convict transportation from Europe ceased to exist in 1840. In 1847, Scottish colonist Benjamin Boyd brought 192 men and women from what is now known as Vanuatu and New Caledonia to New South Wales to work on his estates and on his ships. His second voyage into the islands was extremely violent when his ships bombarded the villages, killing many of their inhabitants. It was not kept a secret as newspapers reported his practices into getting workers, and opinions were split. Landowners, squatters and their allies supported his methods, while ex-convicts and their advocates, city workers, religious leaders and abolitionists opposed him. In response, the Legislative Council of New South Wales passed the Masters and Servants Act 1847, which talked about work contracts, including fines and imprisonment to workers who broke from their employers. In Section 15 of the Act, those from the South Sea Islands, which is the south of the Pacific, were exempt from the provisions of the Act. This made Boyd's contract with the islanders void, and therefore he abandoned his scheme shortly afterwards. The islanders made their way home as soon as possible via ship. Boyd's businesses collapsed. He was removed as the chair of the bank by investors in England, and his position on transportation, workers' wages and his slavery methods left him a few allies. In 1849, he left Sydney for California for the gold fields, but then returned to the Pacific. In 1851, he was killed in Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands by islanders. Despite Boyd's downfall, he influenced Australia's slave trade, known as blackbirding. This was because there was a shortage of workers in Australia. Additionally, there was a colonial belief that South Sea Islanders possessed the physical strength to work long hours in the tropical climate of Queensland, unlike European men. The word blackbirding only came into usage in the 1870s, and the term may have first appeared in newspaper reports around 1872 to 1873. In Queensland, the Blackbirding Period operated from 1860 to 1901. Over 62,000 men and women were brought to Australia from an estimated 80 different islands throughout the Pacific, including Fiji, Kiribati, New Caledonia, Papua New Guinea, Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, in a total of 807 voyages. The vast majority of labourers came from the Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. While some workers were indentured and returned to their islands, many were not. The worst traders resorted to kidnapping and other tricks to convince them to go on board. Once on board, they had no idea of where they were going. More than 13,000 are thought to have died on the voyages or once they arrived in Australia. Although the exact estimate of how many were actually physically forced into being blackbirded hasn't been counted, most historians estimate about 10 to 15% were physically forced. However, historian Clive Morris writes, all of them were culturally kidnapped, meaning that the traders took cultural advantage of the islanders' small-scale societies and convinced them to come to Australia under circumstances they were not aware of. The whole process was monitored by the Queensland government through the Pacific Islanders branch of the Immigration Department. 95% of the labourers were adolescent and young adult males. The terms South Sea Islanders and Kanaka were used to describe them. There are 4 categories that emerge. This is important to talk about because labourers were paid an amount according to the categories they came from. These categories were first-time indentured labourers who had never left their islands before, re-enlistments time-expired labourers and ticket holders. The first-time labourers were paid £6 a year from the 1860s onwards. Re-enlisted labourers were paid £10 a year, although later from the 1890s to 1910s were paid £16 to £23 a year. However, these were just standard pay rates and many were often underpaid. In the worst plantations, they were not given a contract and subsequently were paid nothing. Ticket holders were exempt from the indentured system and could earn a living independently, where some ran small businesses and small farms. Time-expired labourers were those who signed into 1 3-year agreement but chose to stay in Queensland and enter under new agreements. The amount of time-expired labourers grew rapidly, and by 1895 they made up 65% of Melanesians. Islanders, along with Australian First Nations people, were forced to work in various industries, including agricultural, pastoral, maritime, fishing, cotton, pearling, bêche de mer, or sea slug, and railway. While blackbirding is different from the chattel slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, the working conditions endured by Pacific Islanders were not so different to it. First off, the death rate of Islander labourers was extremely high. 14,564 Islander labourers died in Queensland between 1868 and 1906. Between 1863 to 1867, around 100 Pacific Islanders died, making it the highest death rates of immigrants ever in Australia. This is because many Islanders were exposed to a range of diseases that they were not immune to. For Islander new arrivals in Queensland, the most common killers were common colds, tuberculosis, pneumonia, bronchitis and pleurisy. In general, measles and chickenpox caused a large number of deaths. The death rate of labourers in their first year under the indentured system was 81 per 1,000, which was over 3 times the estimated death rate of the general Islander population, 26 per 1,000. Only ticket holders had the lower death rate of 14 per 1,000, a similar death rate to Europeans in Queensland. This is why the present-day Pacific Islander population in Australia is largely descended from ticket holders as well as time-expired labourers. Generally, working conditions were bad, but also differed depending on which plantation labourers were in. One of the worst plantations in Queensland was the Atama Ono plantation, where its labourers worked extremely long hours, heavy labour, horrible food and lack of adequate shelter. Those who did not work were punished severely and many labourers were frequently sick. For one group of blackbirded labourers at the plantation, the death rate was 80%. On the Yeppoon sugar plantation, owned by a Mr. Melhuish, many islanders died due to neglect. Mr. Melhuish was taken to trial and was imposed with a minimum fine of £5, although the judge wished it was an even smaller amount. When the plantation was put up for sale, the islander labourers were included as part of the estate. One significant event that happened was when Captain Lewis Shaw and 4 crew members of a blackbirding vessel named Hopeful were convicted of various crimes, receiving jail sentences of 7 to 10 years in 1884. 2 others were also sentenced to death, although this later changed to life imprisonment. At least 38 islanders had been killed. As a response, the Premier of Queensland in 1885 concluded that the blackbirding trade was no better than the transatlantic slave trade. And in the same year, a ship commissioned by the government of Queensland sent 450 New Guineans back to their homelands. However, all the crew members and the captain were released in 1890 following a petition for their freedom signed by 28,000 Queenslanders. The plantation owners of the New Guineans were compensated for the loss of their enslaved workers. From the 1870s until the early 20th century, Aboriginals, Malays, Timorese and Micronesians were also blackbirded into the pearling industry that was located in Western Australia. About 1,000 Asians were blackbirded, according to historian Kay Forrest. According to missionary and court reports at the time, Aboriginals were rounded up at pastoral stations and sold for £5. Pregnant Aboriginal women were specifically prized because whites believed their lungs held greater air capacity. In the book How the West Was Lost, historian Don MacLeod writes, "Sickness was rife. Colds and influenza typically led to pneumonia and death. The pearlers were alleged to have boasted that so long they could hold their divers for 3 months, they made a profit on their investment. The workers would often die of beriberi, a disease caused by lack of vitamin B1 consumed." Something important to remember is that blackbirding wasn't actually legal, and that the Queensland government introduced many legislations to end the practice. For example, the Polynesian Labourers Act 1868 was passed to try and prevent the exploitation and kidnapping of South Sea Islanders. However, plantation owners and labour agents found many loopholes around the law. Blackbirding ended when Australia became independent from Britain. The 6 colonies became the 6 states of the new federated Australian nation. A new policy known as the White Australia Policy included laws involving the mass deportation of South Sea Islanders. One of the legislations passed was the Immigration Restriction Act, facilitating these deportations. Another act was the Pacific Labourers Act, which made it illegal for any Pacific Islander to enter Australia after March 31st, 1904. Starting in December 1906, any Pacific Islander found on Australian soil could be immediately deported. Employing one would be punishable by law. Over 2 years, from 1906 to 1908, more than 7,500 South Sea Islanders, most of whom were actually born in Australia, were forcibly deported to their home country, quote unquote, even though as Australian-born peoples, they had very little knowledge of their quote unquote home country. Just 1,654 South Sea Islanders were allowed to remain in the country due to exemptions in the Act, including those who were brought to Queensland before September 1st, 1879, those employed in ship's crews, those in possession of a licence allowing them to work under forced labour contracts, and those who had been granted an exception under the Immigration Restriction Act 1901. It took Australia almost a century to confront this dark past, and the history of it was virtually unknown amongst white Australians that make up over 90% of the population. It was only in 1994 that the Commonwealth Government publicly acknowledged the distinctiveness of Australian South Sea Islander culture, and 6 years later in 2000 the Queensland Government did the same. Since then, August 25th is marked South Sea Islander Recognition Day. In August 2021, Jack Dempsey, the mayor of Bundaberg, the 10th largest city in Queensland, issued an official apology to the region's South Sea Islanders for the abuse which occurred in blackbirding people from Vanuatu and other Pacific islands to work in the Queensland sugarcane industry, which was built on the backs of Pacific Island labour, along with much of our infrastructure. Today, South Sea Islanders make up 3,500 individuals. Despite the end of blackbirding, slavery against Aboriginals did not end and actually continued up until the 1970s. It was only in 1967 when Aboriginals were accepted as human beings and given the same welfare and citizenship rights as the rest of the Australian population. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.